In the winter of 1977, Andrew Faulkner walked to the corner store and vanished. The only clue left behind? A jagged trail of blood frozen in a snowbank. For 30 years, the case was a ghost. No weapon, no motive, and no leads. But while his family spent decades searching for a monster, they didn't realize they were already looking at him. In 2007, a breakthrough in forensic science revealed a terrifying truth. The killer hadn't run away. He'd been living 3 houses down, watching them grieve from his front porch every single day. This is the chilling story of the man who hid in plain sight. Today, we're stepping inside the archives to see exactly how a 30-year-old secret was finally unraveled. You're watching the Cold Case Archives. At Cold Case Archives, we don't just tell stories. We bridge the gap between old-school detective work and the modern science that's catching killers decades later. If you believe that no crime should stay hidden and no victim should be forgotten, you're in the right place. Please hit subscribe. Your support helps us in uncovering more truth together. Welcome to the archives. The street was quiet, the kind of residential road police usually pass without slowing down. 2 lanes, snow pushed to the sides, a single street lamp throwing light across packed ice. Nothing broken, no signs of a crash, no crowd, no shouting neighbors, just snow. Then the flashlight beam moved. Near the curb, along the edge of the road, the snow wasn't white anymore. It was stained. Not splattered, not scattered, pressed deep into the surface, as if something warm had been forced down and held there long enough to soak through the top layer. This wasn't a spill. This wasn't an accident. The stain ran several feet, uneven but directional, cutting across the snowbank toward the street. It wasn't random. It followed a line. Police stopped walking. They started measuring. Because blood like this doesn't appear on its own. There was no body. That was the first problem. No victim nearby, no collapsed figure hidden by snow, no sign that anyone had fallen and stood back up. If someone had been hurt here, they didn't walk away. There were no footprints either, not leading toward the houses, not leading back toward the sidewalk, not even partial impressions fading into slush. The snowfall that night had been light, not enough to erase everything. If someone had run, slipped, or struggled, something should have remained. There were also no shell casings, no glass, no torn clothing, no weapon, just blood, frozen into layers of snow, with a shape that suggested force and movement. Not a single moment, but a process. Police marked the location, 2 blocks from the nearest house connected to the report that would soon come in. Too far for coincidence, too close to ignore. The blood wasn't sitting on top of the snow. It had sunk down. That mattered. It meant the bleeding started while the snow was already on the ground. It meant the blood was fresh when it hit, still warm enough to melt into the surface before freezing solid. The edges weren't sharp. They were compressed. Someone hadn't just fallen here. Someone had been pressed into the snow, and the direction of the smear pointed away from the houses, toward the road, toward where a vehicle could stop without drawing attention. Investigators followed the line and stopped again. There were drag marks, subtle, interrupted, as if weight had been shifted, lifted slightly, then set down again. This wasn't panic. This wasn't chaos. It looked controlled. The location raised another question. Why here? The blood was found nearly 400 yards from Andrew Faulkner's home. Too far for a stumble, too far for a casual walk gone wrong. Yet close enough that whoever was involved knew the area well. This wasn't a highway. This wasn't a dark industrial road. This was a neighborhood street, which meant the person responsible didn't fear being seen or knew exactly when they wouldn't be. That detail angered detectives, because crimes like this don't happen in isolation. They happen when someone feels safe doing them, safe enough to stop, safe enough to act, safe enough to leave. The absence of footprints forced a conclusion. If Andrew had arrived on foot, his steps would have marked the snow. If he had left on foot, the same would be true. But there was nothing, which meant he didn't leave the way he arrived. The drag marks stopped abruptly, as if whatever weight was being moved had been lifted completely off the ground. That only leaves one explanation: a vehicle. Someone had pulled up, close enough to the curb. Someone had used the car to remove Andrew from the scene. And once that car drove away, the street returned to stillness, carrying the evidence with it. The blood stayed. Everything else was gone. By the time the area was taped off, investigators already understood the danger of what they were looking at: a violent act with no body, a controlled removal, a location chosen, not stumbled into. And the most troubling part wasn't what the evidence showed. It was what it suggested. Whoever did this didn't panic. They didn't flee blindly. They didn't make mistakes that night. They went home. Someone bled here, but they didn't die here. This case stayed open because the evidence didn't lie. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Andrew Faulkner did not leave his house dressed for anything unusual. He wore a navy blue winter parka, thick enough to handle February temperatures in Michigan, but common enough that dozens of men on the block owned something similar. The coat zipped fully up the front with a padded collar and deep side pockets. It showed normal wear along the cuffs and zipper seam, suggesting frequent use, not something saved for special occasions. Under the coat, Andrew wore a simple sweater and work pants. The clothing was practical, clean, and consistent with someone planning to return quickly. There was no extra layering, no backpack, no bag, nothing that suggested preparation for an extended trip. On his feet were insulated winter boots with rubber soles designed to grip snow-covered sidewalks. These boots were important later. They were heavy enough to leave clear impressions in fresh snow, especially on packed surfaces near the curb. What Andrew did not wear also mattered. He did not take gloves. He did not take a hat. That absence suggested urgency, not fear. He was stepping out briefly, expecting to be back indoors before the cold became a problem. This was not the clothing of a man anticipating danger or confrontation. Nothing about what Andrew wore indicated secrecy, planning, or risk. It looked like the uniform of routine. Investigators did not rely on guesswork when it came to how far Andrew Faulkner walked that night. The route from his front door to the pharmacy was later measured using a rolling distance wheel, following the exact sidewalk and curb line he would have taken. The total distance came out to just under 400 yards. At a normal walking pace, even factoring in winter conditions, the trip would take no more than 4 minutes one way. The entire errand should have been finished in less than 10 minutes. That short distance immediately ruled out several early assumptions. Andrew left his car keys on the kitchen table. He also left his wallet behind, carrying only loose bills in his pocket. That combination mattered. It confirmed he had no intention of driving, no intention of stopping anywhere else, and no intention of being away for long. The route itself was direct. No alleys, no shortcuts, no unlit detours. The sidewalk ran straight from his house to the store, passing familiar homes and well-known corners. Because the distance was so short, investigators focused on timing. A disappearance along a 400-yard route pointed to interruption, not misdirection. Andrew didn't get lost. He was stopped. The pharmacy transaction created the most reliable time marker in the entire case. Andrew Faulkner's purchase was recorded at 7:15 p.m. The receipt was time-stamped automatically, leaving no room for interpretation or memory errors. That single detail locked the investigation into a narrow window that could not be widened later. The clerk on duty, Bartholomew, confirmed the transaction. Business was slow that evening due to the weather, which made Andrew easier to remember. He paid in cash, collected the cough syrup, and exchanged a brief comment about the cold before heading for the door. Bartholomew watched Andrew leave the store. He did not see anyone approach him. He did not notice anyone waiting nearby. He did not hear raised voices or movement outside. No vehicles were reported idling in front of the pharmacy at that time. No sudden departures, no unusual activity that would have stood out against an otherwise quiet night. From an investigative standpoint, that mattered. It meant the encounter that followed did not begin inside the store and did not involve the clerk or any visible confrontation. Once Andrew stepped back into the snow at 7:15 p.m., the clock started working against whoever crossed his path. By 7:30 p.m., Andrew should have been home. That 15-minute gap became the most critical period in the case. It was too short for coincidence and too precise to ignore. Anyone responsible had to act quickly, decisively, and without drawing attention. Every minute after 7:15 narrowed the suspect pool. The weather that night explained part of the mystery, but not all of it. Snow had been falling lightly for several hours before Andrew left the pharmacy. It wasn't heavy snowfall, it was steady, thin, and wind-driven. The temperature sat well below freezing, which meant the snow stayed dry and loose on the surface rather than turning to slush. Wind direction came from the northwest, pushing snow across open pavement and along the curb line. That movement mattered. Light footprints made early in the evening could soften or blur within minutes, especially on exposed sidewalks. But deeper impressions were different. The boots Andrew wore were insulated and heavy. Under normal conditions, they would have left clear tread marks, especially where snow had already packed down. Investigators knew this because they tested similar footwear in nearby areas under the same conditions. Those test prints held. So the absence of footprints near the blood site raised a problem. Snowfall alone could not account for it. The wind could distort shallow marks, but it could not erase everything without time, which meant Andrew was likely no longer walking freely at that point. The snow near the stain showed compression without tread patterns. Weight had been applied unevenly, pressed down rather than stepped through. That difference separated movement from displacement. In simple terms, someone wasn't walking there. They were being moved. Robbery was considered briefly, then set aside. There was no sign that Andrew had been searched at the scene. His pockets weren't pulled inside out. There was no scattered change in the snow, no torn fabric, no dropped items that suggested a struggle over property. More importantly, Andrew wasn't carrying anything worth taking. He had paid for the cough syrup with loose bills. His wallet was still at home. His car keys were also left behind. There was no watch reported missing, no ring, no bag, nothing that would justify forcing someone into a vehicle or moving them away from the scene. Robberies are fast. They rely on surprise and escape. They don't involve relocation unless something goes wrong, and even then, it creates risk most attackers avoid. Here, the opposite happened. Whoever stopped Andrew increased their exposure by staying, controlling him, and removing him from the street. That choice made no sense if the goal was money. It made sense only if the goal was the person. That conclusion shifted the investigation away from random encounters and toward intent. The items Andrew left behind narrowed intent more than any witness statement. His wallet remained on the kitchen table. Inside were his identification, personal papers, and anything that could tie him to other locations. His car keys were next to it. That meant Andrew never considered driving. He never considered stopping elsewhere. He expected to walk out and walk straight back. From an investigative standpoint, that eliminated several possibilities at once. He wasn't meeting someone. He wasn't planning to travel. He wasn't preparing for a delay. People who anticipate uncertainty take essentials. Andrew didn't. He took only what was necessary to buy medicine and return home. That detail also mattered for timing. Without keys, Andrew had no independent transportation. Once intercepted, he couldn't leave on his own terms. Control shifted immediately to whoever confronted him. It also ruled out prearranged conflict. If Andrew expected trouble, he would have prepared differently. The absence of preparation told investigators the encounter was introduced by someone else, not initiated by him. The wallet and keys didn't just show routine, they showed vulnerability. Random attacks leave disorder behind. This case did not. There were no reports of shouting along the route. No neighbors heard a struggle. No nearby residents reported doors opening or lights switching on in response to noise. The street stayed quiet. That silence mattered. Random violence depends on opportunity. It erupts quickly and ends just as fast. The person responsible usually escapes on foot, leaving confusion, fragments, and mistakes behind. Here, the opposite occurred. Andrew was intercepted along a predictable route during a narrow time window, in a location that allowed a vehicle to stop briefly without drawing attention. The encounter ended without visible chaos. The scene showed control, not panic. The blood evidence suggested force was applied efficiently. There was no spread consistent with a prolonged fight. No signs of resistance moving across the street. Whatever happened unfolded fast enough to keep the surroundings unchanged. That level of restraint doesn't come from chance. It comes from familiarity, with the area, the timing, and the person involved. Investigators began to understand that Andrew wasn't chosen at random. He was encountered by someone who already knew where he would be and when. This was not violence looking for a victim. It was violence waiting for one. By 7:15 p.m., Andrew Faulkner left the pharmacy. That moment was fixed. It would never change. By 7:30 p.m., he should have been home. The walk was short. The route was direct. There were no known delays along the way. When he didn't return within that window, the routine he followed so closely broke for the first time. Everything that mattered happened between those 2 points. Investigators narrowed the window further. Given the distance and walking speed, Andrew would have reached the stretch of road where the blood was found within minutes of leaving the store. That placed the encounter very close to 7:20 p.m. The tighter the window became, the fewer people could realistically fit inside it. Strangers passing through were unlikely. Someone cruising the area at random would have had to appear at exactly the right time, in exactly the right place, and act without hesitation. That kind of coincidence didn't align with what the evidence showed. The timeline favored someone who already knew Andrew's habits, someone who didn't need to follow him, someone who didn't need to wait long, someone who expected him. By the end of the reconstruction, investigators weren't searching for a vague event anymore. They were looking for a person whose movements overlapped Andrew's during a specific 10 to 15-minute window on a single winter night. That realization marked a turning point. From that point forward, the question wasn't when Andrew disappeared. It was who was in position when he did. The discovery was not the result of a search warrant or a tip. It happened during routine maintenance. In early April, as winter began to loosen its hold on the outskirts of the city, a municipal worker was clearing debris near a drainage culvert bordering an industrial service road. The area sat far from residential blocks, bordered by unused lots, stacked materials, and access paths meant for delivery trucks rather than pedestrians. As accumulated snow receded, something dark became visible beneath a thin layer of ice and brush. At first glance, it appeared to be discarded clothing caught against scrap wood. When the worker moved closer, the outline didn't change. A navy parka lay partially covered, its sleeve trapped beneath a wooden pallet. The jacket matched the description circulated weeks earlier when Andrew Faulkner failed to return home. Police arrived within minutes. What they found beneath the clothing confirmed what the melting snow had concealed for nearly 2 months. Andrew Faulkner's body was found partially concealed beneath 2 wooden pallets and a layer of compacted snow mixed with debris. The covering was not accidental. The pallets were aligned parallel to each other, placed flat, and weighted down by ice buildup from repeated freezes. Cold temperatures had slowed physical breakdown. Skin, clothing, and wound structure remained identifiable. There was no advanced bloating, no extensive tissue separation, and no signs of prolonged exposure damage that would indicate he had been left alive outdoors. His clothing was intact, no tearing consistent with a street fight, no disarray suggesting a prolonged struggle at the dump site. The coat was zipped. His boots were still on his feet. This mattered. Bodies abandoned hastily are often left exposed, unevenly positioned, or partially scattered due to animal activity or weather movement. None of that was present here. The placement suggested deliberate handling after death. There were no signs of burning, chemical exposure, or attempts to destroy identifying features. Whoever placed him there did not attempt to erase identity, only to delay discovery. That distinction mattered to investigators. It suggested confidence rather than panic. The extended cold worked against the person responsible in ways they likely did not anticipate. From late January through early March, temperatures stayed low enough to keep the ground frozen. Snowfall accumulated in layers, compacting over time rather than melting away. This created a stable cover that limited exposure to air, moisture cycling, and animal interference. As a result, key physical markers remained intact. Blood within the fabric of Andrew's clothing did not spread or degrade. Wound edges retained their shape. The alignment of clothing layers stayed consistent with how the body had been placed, not shifted by environmental forces. This preservation allowed the medical examiner to distinguish between injuries sustained before death and changes that occurred afterward. There was no evidence of frost-related cracking or tissue breakdown that would suggest prolonged surface exposure before death. The condition of the remains confirmed that Andrew had been deceased before arriving at the dump site. The cold had not caused death. It had only slowed what followed. That distinction removed several early theories from consideration and gave investigators a rare advantage. Time had paused the physical record rather than erased it. Andrew's body was positioned on its right side, with the knees slightly drawn and the arms held close to the torso. The posture was compact and stable, not awkward or collapsed. This detail immediately stood out to investigators. People who die where they fall usually land unevenly. Limbs extend outward. Clothing shifts. Here, none of that was present. The alignment suggested the body had been placed deliberately after death. There were no impressions in the surrounding ground consistent with a struggle at the site. No disturbed soil, no drag marks leading into the pallet stack. The snow and debris beneath the body were compressed evenly, indicating it had been lowered rather than dropped. This mattered for one reason. Lowering a body requires time, control, and physical effort. It also requires confidence that the location is secure enough to allow those actions without interruption. The way Andrew was positioned showed the person responsible was not rushing. They adjusted placement to keep the body stable and concealed, minimizing the chance that shifting snow or wind would expose it prematurely. That choice reinforced a critical conclusion. This location was selected in advance. The autopsy revealed 3 gunshot wounds. 2 bullets entered the torso. 1 entered the back of the head. All were .22 caliber. The entry points were tight and clean, consistent with close-range discharge. There was no wide dispersion, no grazing, and no evidence of uncontrolled firing. The placement suggested intent rather than reaction. The torso wounds showed downward trajectories, indicating Andrew was either seated or already lowered when they were fired. The head wound entered from behind, slightly above the base of the skull. That angle mattered. It indicated the final shot was delivered when Andrew was no longer facing the shooter. All 3 bullets were recovered during examination. The projectiles showed minimal deformation, which suggested they had not passed through bone at extreme angles or ricocheted off hard surfaces. This allowed investigators to preserve them for future comparison. Another detail stood out. The ammunition was not cheap bulk stock. It was a higher quality round commonly used for controlled target shooting. That didn't identify a suspect, but it narrowed the profile. Whoever fired those shots cared about reliability and accuracy. This was not reckless firing. It was measured. The medical examination found no injuries consistent with resistance. Andrew's hands showed no fractures. The fingers were intact. There were no deep cuts across the palms or knuckles. The forearms carried no bruising associated with blocking blows or grappling. This absence mattered more than visible trauma. When people are attacked unexpectedly, the body reacts on instinct. Hands come up, arms move forward. Even brief resistance leaves marks. Here, there were none. That meant Andrew was not fighting when the shots were fired. Investigators considered several possibilities. He may have been restrained earlier. He may have been seated. He may have been compliant under threat. What mattered was that control had already been established before the weapon was used. This finding aligned with other physical details: the lack of torn clothing, the clean bullet paths, the controlled placement of the body afterward. Taken together, the evidence pointed away from a sudden street confrontation and toward a situation where Andrew was already contained. The shooting was not chaotic. It was the final step. The place where Andrew was found was as important as the condition of his body. The industrial access road sat far from residential traffic. It was used primarily during daytime hours by delivery vehicles and maintenance crews. At night, it was quiet. No storefronts, no nearby homes, no routine patrol presence. This was not a location chosen by chance. Access required a vehicle. The road layout allowed a car or truck to stop briefly without blocking traffic. Headlights would not have drawn attention, and engine noise would have blended into the background of nearby equipment yards. Investigators noted something else. The site offered concealment without isolation. Someone familiar with the area would know workers passed through occasionally, but not frequently enough to trigger immediate discovery. That balance delayed detection without risking complete loss of the body to environmental damage. This mattered because it suggested planning rather than desperation. A person acting under pressure would choose the nearest hidden spot. Here, distance was added intentionally. Andrew was moved miles away from where he was last seen, reducing the chance that early searches would cross paths with the dump site. The location served one purpose: time. The wooden pallets were not debris left behind by chance. They were placed. Each pallet rested flat, aligned with the ground rather than tipped or broken. Their weight pressed down on the snow and debris beneath them, anchoring Andrew's body in place through weeks of freeze and thaw. That choice served several functions. First, the pallets created visual obstruction. From a distance, they looked like discarded materials common in industrial zones. Nothing about them drew attention or suggested a body beneath. Second, they reduced scent spread. Airflow beneath the pallets was limited, which lowered the chance of detection by animals or passers-by during warmer periods. Third, they required no transport. The pallets were already on site. Using them avoided bringing in new materials that could later be traced or remembered. This was not a random cover. It was a practical solution chosen by someone who understood the environment and used what was available to delay discovery without increasing risk. That detail stayed with investigators for years, because people who act without thought do not stack pallets. They drop, flee, and hope. The physical evidence made one conclusion unavoidable. Andrew Faulkner did not die at the location where he was found. There was no blood pooling beneath the body, no saturation in the surrounding ground consistent with active bleeding. The clothing absorbed what little transfer occurred, but the soil beneath remained largely undisturbed. Gunshot wounds of that nature produce immediate blood loss. If the shots had been fired there, the ground would have shown it. It didn't. This meant Andrew had been killed somewhere else and transported afterward. Moving a body introduces risk, time, exposure, and mechanical failure. People only accept that risk when the original location presents a greater threat to them than transport does. That detail narrowed the possibilities. The shooting likely occurred indoors or inside a vehicle, somewhere controlled, somewhere sound would not carry. Somewhere cleanup was possible. The dump site was never meant to be part of the act itself. It was meant to erase it from view. That final decision, to relocate, conceal, and wait, reflected planning, not impulse. This wasn't a panic dump. It was planned. The bullet paths told a partial story, but not a complete one. The medical examiner documented 3 clear trajectories. 2 rounds entered the torso at a downward angle. The third entered the back of the head, traveling slightly downward before lodging forward. From those angles alone, investigators could rule out several scenarios. Andrew was not standing upright when he was shot. The downward paths suggested he was either seated, kneeling, or already lowered at the time the weapon was fired. The head wound, delivered from behind, further supported that he was not facing the shooter during the final shot. That answered one question. It did not answer where the shooting occurred. In 1977, trajectory analysis could establish direction, but not environment. There was no way to determine whether the shots were fired inside a vehicle, inside a structure, or outdoors with confidence. Sound dispersion, surface reflections, and enclosed space indicators were beyond the tools available at the time. There was also no way to determine sequence with certainty. While the head wound was likely last, the examiner could not conclusively state the order of the torso shots. The bullets confirmed control. They did not reveal location. That limitation forced investigators to rely on physical context instead of medical certainty. And it left a critical gap that would haunt the case for years. The autopsy could not pinpoint an exact time of death. What it could do was narrow the window. Based on body temperature loss, preservation from cold, and the state of internal organs, the medical examiner placed death within a broad range, several hours after Andrew was last seen alive. That range overlapped multiple shifts, multiple locations, and dozens of potential movements. Cold complicated everything. Low temperatures slowed biological change. which preserved evidence but also erased time markers normally used to estimate death. Rigor patterns were unreliable. Tissue response progressed unevenly. The usual indicators did not align cleanly. This created a problem for investigators. They could not tie the shooting to a specific hour. They could not match it to a particular vehicle sighting or reported sound. Anyone with an alibi that spanned part of the night remained difficult to challenge. What the estimate did confirm was this: Andrew did not die immediately after leaving the pharmacy. Enough time had passed for him to be moved, controlled, and relocated before the shots were fired. That single detail reshaped the case. It meant the encounter was not brief. It meant there was time. The contents of Andrew Faulkner's stomach raised a quiet but serious problem. The medical examiner identified partially digested food that did not match what Andrew was known to have eaten before leaving his house. The digestion stage suggested the meal had been consumed earlier than expected, earlier than his trip to the pharmacy. That detail mattered. Andrew left home for a quick errand. He did not stop to eat. He carried no food with him. The pharmacy sold medicine, not meals. Yet the stomach contents indicated he had eaten something substantial within a time frame that conflicted with the established schedule. This introduced a new question. If Andrew did not eat that food at home and did not buy it during the errand, where did it come from? 1977. Forensics could identify general food types, not exact sources. There was no way to trace it to a restaurant, a household, or a packaged product. The evidence could suggest timing, but not location. Still, it did one critical thing. It implied Andrew spent time somewhere after leaving the pharmacy, time long enough to eat or be fed. That possibility aligned with other findings that suggested he was held rather than attacked immediately. The stomach contents answered one question about duration. They created a larger one about location. Among the clothing fibers collected during examination, one stood apart. A single yellow synthetic strand was found embedded in the lining of Andrew's coat. It did not match the fabric of his clothing. It was not consistent with the pallets used to cover the body, and it was not present elsewhere on the remains. In 1977, fiber analysis was limited. Investigators could identify general material type and color, but not manufacturing origin. There was no database to search, no digital comparison system to consult. Still, the fiber mattered. Its placement suggested contact, not transfer by wind or environment. It was lodged deep enough to indicate pressure. That meant proximity to another surface or garment at some point after Andrew left home. Investigators cataloged it carefully and preserved it. That single strand could not identify a suspect, but it could exclude many. For years it remained in evidence, small, unresolved, and persistent. As technology advanced, it would be re-examined, compared, and questioned again. This single fiber kept the case alive for decades. Investigators began with a simple constraint. Andrew Faulkner did not disappear from an open area by chance. Whoever intercepted him had access, not just to the street, but to timing, proximity, and privacy. The first filter was geographic. Police mapped residents and regular visitors along Andrew's walking route. This included neighbors, delivery drivers, maintenance workers, and anyone whose daily schedule overlapped the short window between 7:15 and 7:30 p.m. Access meant more than living nearby. It meant being present without raising attention. The second filter was opportunity. Who could stop a man mid-walk without force drawing notice? Who could speak to him briefly without suspicion? That narrowed the field further. A stranger would have struggled to explain a pause. Someone familiar would not. Investigators paid close attention to individuals who had legitimate reasons to be in vehicles on residential streets at night: shift workers, contractors, and people connected to nearby industrial properties. A stopped car alone wasn't suspicious. Context mattered. Access also included familiarity with the dump site. The industrial access road where Andrew was found was not marked clearly and was rarely used after hours. Knowledge of that location implied repeated exposure, work-related or routine, not discovery by accident. By the end of this phase, the suspect pool was smaller than the community expected. It wasn't wide, it was specific. Once access narrowed the pool, investigators focused on transportation. Andrew did not vanish on foot. The blood evidence, lack of extended footprints, and distance to the dump site all pointed to a vehicle. That shifted attention to who could stop briefly, load a person, and leave without notice. Vehicle ownership records were reviewed for the area surrounding Andrew's route and nearby industrial properties. Investigators prioritized cars large enough to move a person without obvious exposure and common enough to avoid standing out. One vehicle type surfaced repeatedly. A yellow 1975 sedan had been reported in the neighborhood on multiple evenings during the winter. It was not tied to a crime report at the time, but residents recalled it idling briefly along side streets, then leaving. The color made it memorable. The behavior did not. Registration checks reduced the list to a small number of owners with routine access to the area. Most were cleared quickly due to work schedules or verified locations elsewhere that night. A few could not be cleared. Investigators also considered vehicle interiors. A trunk or rear seat could account for the absence of drag marks and explain how Andrew was moved without resistance at the street level. Snow transfer into a car would have been minimal if the loading was quick. The vehicle angle did not identify a suspect, but it reduced the list again. With vehicle access established, investigators turned to weapons. The recovered bullets were .22 caliber, a common round, but the pattern of use was not. The shot placement showed control and familiarity. This was not casual handling or panic firing. That distinction mattered. Investigators cross-referenced firearm ownership records where available, focusing on individuals within the narrowed access and vehicle pool. While private ownership records were incomplete in 1977, membership rosters offered another path. Local gun clubs were reviewed. Membership suggested regular handling, practice, and familiarity with accuracy rather than novelty. It also suggested access to higher-grade ammunition, the same type recovered during the autopsy. Several names overlapped. Not all gun owners were suspects. Most were cleared quickly. What stood out were individuals who combined firearm access with vehicle access and unsupervised evening hours. Investigators also considered disposal. Someone comfortable with firearms would also understand how to avoid leaving shell casings, how to clean residue, and how to separate a weapon from a crime scene entirely. The absence of the gun supported that assumption. Firearm access did not identify the killer, but it removed anyone who didn't have it. The final filter was knowledge. Andrew Faulkner followed habits that rarely changed. He walked the same route. He kept consistent hours. He handled errands the same way each time. That predictability reduced randomness and increased exposure to anyone paying attention. Investigators looked for people who could anticipate his movements without following him. This included neighbors, co-workers, and anyone who crossed his path regularly enough to notice patterns. It also included individuals who lived or worked close enough to observe his routine without effort. Understanding routine mattered for timing. The narrow window between 7:15 and 7:30 p.m. required confidence. Someone acting without knowledge would have needed luck. Someone familiar would not. Alibi verification focused on this group. Statements were checked against work logs, shift schedules, and known movements. Some held up. Others did not. Not because they were false, but because they lacked independent confirmation. Two men stood out, for opposite reasons. One had access, a vehicle, and firearm familiarity, but a verified timeline. The other had access, opportunity, and routine overlap, but an alibi built only on his own account. Neither could be charged, but both remained in the file. By the time investigators narrowed their suspect list, the problem was no longer discovery, it was threshold. Prosecutors reviewed the file with a single question in mind. Could this evidence survive a courtroom challenge? The answer, repeatedly, was no. Circumstantial evidence does not mean weak evidence. It means evidence that requires inference rather than direct observation. In this case, every major point relied on linkage rather than presence. No witness saw Andrew enter a vehicle. No witness saw a weapon. No witness placed a suspect at the scene of death. Each individual fact made sense on its own. Together, they suggested intent and planning. But suggestion was not enough. To issue a warrant, prosecutors needed probable cause that tied a specific person to a specific act. The case had patterns, access, and opportunity, but no direct bridge between suspect and crime. Moving forward without that bridge carried risk. A failed arrest would expose evidence early, lock testimony in place, and give a suspect insight into investigative gaps. Prosecutors chose restraint over speed. The case did not stall because investigators stopped working. It stalled because the standard had not been met. The term became a stopping point, not a conclusion. In this case, circumstantial did not mean speculative. It meant that every fact required a step in between. Evidence pointed toward a conclusion, but it did not place anyone's hands on the act itself. Investigators could show that Andrew was intercepted. They could show he was transported. They could show he was shot elsewhere and concealed. What they could not show was who performed each step. No fingerprint was tied to the body. No firearm was recovered. No witness placed a suspect in the vehicle. Each gap mattered on its own. Together, they created reasonable doubt before a trial even began. Prosecutors explained it plainly. A jury could believe the theory and still vote not guilty. That outcome would not only end the case, it would prevent future charges if stronger evidence emerged later. So the label mattered. Circumstantial meant the story was clear, but the handoff between facts was invisible. Without a single direct link, a statement, a recovery, or a confirmed transfer, the case could not move forward legally. That was not a judgment of truth. It was a limitation of proof. By this stage, one name sat closer to the center of the file than the rest: Gideon. Investigators believed he had access, opportunity, and familiarity with Andrew's routine. He owned a vehicle consistent with movement patterns examined early in the case. He also had experience handling firearms. What he did not have was a provable act. There was no witness who saw Andrew enter Gideon's car. No physical trace from Andrew was recovered from Gideon's vehicle, residence, or belongings. The yellow fiber could not be matched to anything he owned at the time. His alibi was weak, but legally sufficient. He claimed to be home that evening. No one could place him elsewhere. No record contradicted his statement. In 1977, absence of proof was not proof of absence, but it was enough to block an arrest. Prosecutors required more than suspicion layered on logic. They needed a direct tie, a recovered weapon, a verified movement, or a statement that could be tested. None existed. Arresting Gideon without that would have risked immediate release and permanent damage to the case. Once charged, every future interview, search, or evidence review would face higher legal barriers. So investigators waited. not because they believed Gideon was innocent, because they could not yet prove he was guilty. When forward movement stopped, preservation began. Every major physical item was sealed and catalogued. The bullets were labeled, packaged, and stored under controlled conditions. The yellow fiber was mounted, documented, and boxed separately to avoid contamination. Andrew's coat was cleaned only as required for examination, then sealed and archived. Nothing was destroyed. This mattered because the case was never closed. It was suspended, waiting for a future where proof standards could be met differently. As years passed, storage practices changed. Technology advanced. What once produced limited answers now held potential. The file remained active in a quiet way. Everything was preserved, waiting. Not every unsolved case is reopened. Investigators don't return to old files based on age or attention. They return based on potential. The question is simple. Can modern tools answer questions the original investigation could not? This case met that test. The evidence had been preserved properly. Key items were sealed early and left untouched. There were no chain of custody gaps that would weaken later analysis. Most importantly, the case hinged on physical contact rather than eyewitness memory. That distinction mattered. Advances in forensic science favor cases where touch, handling, or proximity played a role. Andrew's disappearance and death involved all three. He was intercepted, moved, and handled. Each step increased the chance that microscopic material transferred between people and objects. Another factor pushed the case forward. The suspect pool was already narrow. Investigators weren't reopening a file with hundreds of unknowns. They were reopening one with defined names, defined timelines, and unanswered questions that had stalled for technical reasons, not lack of effort. When the evidence room inventory was reviewed decades later, this case stood out. It wasn't forgotten. It was waiting. When the file was reopened, investigators applied a checklist. The bullets, coat, and fiber had remained sealed since the original examination. Labels were intact. Storage conditions were documented. Nothing had been rehandled casually or exposed to uncontrolled environments. This case involved close physical interaction. Andrew had been intercepted, moved, and positioned. That meant hands, clothing, and surfaces likely made contact long enough for transfer to occur. Investigators weren't reopening the case to search blindly. They had specific gaps: who handled Andrew's coat, who moved him, and whether any contact could be linked to known individuals. The suspect list was limited. Names had already been evaluated decades earlier. If new material surfaced, there were people to compare it against. With those factors met, detectives decided what to examine first. They did not start with the bullets. Metal surfaces offered limited recovery potential after earlier handling. They did not start with the pallets. Environmental exposure made them unreliable. They started with clothing, specifically the coat. Clothing absorbs contact. It traps fibers, skin cells, and pressure points. Unlike hard surfaces, it records interaction rather than shedding it. The coat had been worn during the interception, the movement, and the concealment. If anything held answers, it was there. The coat was removed from storage under controlled conditions. Investigators documented its condition before any testing began. Seams, cuffs, interior lining, and collar were photographed and logged. Areas most likely to have been gripped or pressed were marked for priority review. They worked methodically. The collar came first. When a person is moved against their will, the collar is often used for leverage. It's a natural grip point, close to the center of balance, easy to hold, and capable of controlling movement without leaving obvious marks. That made it a focal area. The inner lining of the collar was examined for compression patterns. Investigators noted subtle deformation where fabric had been folded inward, consistent with force applied from behind. That detail had not been actionable decades earlier. Now it guided testing. Cuffs and shoulders followed. Those areas often capture contact during lifting or repositioning. Even brief handling can transfer microscopic material that remains trapped in fabric weave. Detectives avoided broad testing. They targeted zones where contact was most likely. This reduced contamination risk and increased the chance of meaningful recovery. Only after those areas were mapped did they authorize modern extraction. The testing method used did not exist in 1977. Investigators employed an MVAC system, a process that uses a controlled stream of sterile solution and vacuum pressure to lift microscopic material from fabric. Unlike swabs, which touch only the surface, this method pulls material from within the weave. Visually, the process is simple to understand. Liquid passes over the target area. Pressure dislodges trapped particles. A vacuum captures what is released. Everything collected is filtered and preserved for analysis. This mattered because the coat had already been handled years earlier. Traditional swabbing would have missed material buried deeper in the fibers. MVAC did not rely on visible stains or obvious residue. It recovered what time left behind. Touch DNA works differently from older testing. It does not require blood or fluid. It relies on skin cells transferred through contact, gripping, lifting, or steady pressure. Even brief handling can leave enough material to analyze if it's captured correctly. The collar mattered because it concentrates force. When someone controls another person from behind, pressure builds at that point. Fabric compresses. Cells transfer. The inner lining holds them in place, protected from weather and movement. That is where analysts focused. What came back from testing did not answer every question, but it created a bridge where none had existed before, between evidence and identity. This tool didn't exist when the crime happened. The DNA result did not return a name. It returned a pattern. The material recovered from the coat collar was incomplete. There was not enough genetic data to produce a full profile suitable for a direct database hit. Instead, analysts generated a partial profile, a sequence with missing markers, but enough structure to be useful. This mattered because partial does not mean unusable. A partial profile can still be compared. It can still exclude most people. And under the right conditions, it can narrow a field dramatically. Analysts ran the profile through national databases using parameters designed to detect shared genetic markers rather than exact matches. This process looks for overlap consistent with close biological relationships: parents, children, siblings. The logic is statistical, not speculative. If enough markers align beyond random probability, the system flags the result for review. The strength of the signal determines how close the relationship is likely to be. In this case, the signal was strong enough to rule out coincidence. It suggested a direct family connection. That result forced investigators to reframe the file. The evidence was no longer anonymous. It was no longer untethered. It now pointed toward a family line rather than an individual, and that changed how every earlier detail would be evaluated. Familial DNA does not identify a suspect outright. It reduces distance. Using the partial profile, analysts searched for individuals whose genetic markers overlapped in statistically meaningful ways. These were not matches in the traditional sense. They were indicators of shared lineage, enough to suggest close relation, not enough to name a person. The results returned a short list. Each entry represented someone already in the database for unrelated reasons. None were tied directly to Andrew's case. What mattered was proximity within family trees, not criminal history. Investigators mapped relationships outward: parents, siblings, children, cousins. Each connection was evaluated against geography, age, and access during the winter of 1977. Many names were eliminated quickly. Some lived too far away. Others were too young. Several had no connection to Michigan at the time. One branch held. That family line intersected with the original suspect pool from decades earlier. The overlap was not exact, but it was close enough to demand attention. Someone connected by blood had already appeared in the file, long before DNA entered the picture. Familial DNA didn't accuse anyone. It pointed investigators back to a place they had already been, this time with direction instead of theory. Once the family line was identified, investigators returned to the file with a new constraint. They were no longer asking what happened. They were asking which details now mattered more. Timelines were revisited first. Movements that once seemed unremarkable were rechecked against work records, address histories, and vehicle access tied to the identified family branch. Small overlaps gained weight. Gaps that had once been tolerated were no longer ignored. The yellow fiber was pulled from storage again. Decades earlier, it had been logged as synthetic and unresolved. Now, analysts compared it against modern reference libraries. The material composition matched automotive carpeting commonly used in mid-1970s American sedans. That reframed earlier assumptions. The fiber was no longer abstract. It was no longer just foreign. It now suggested interior contact, consistent with transport inside a vehicle rather than brief outdoor contact. That detail aligned with the DNA result. Both pointed toward close physical proximity in a confined space. Investigators also reconsidered why certain areas had been clean. The lack of transfer at the street made sense if the primary interaction happened elsewhere. The coat had recorded the encounter. The environment had not. None of this created a charge, but it reorganized the file. The evidence had not changed. Its meaning had. With the DNA context established, analysts focused on narrowing the vehicle question. The yellow fiber was examined again using modern material comparison techniques. Its polymer structure, dye composition, and backing weave were consistent with automotive carpet used in a limited production range during the mid-1970s. This was not generic flooring. Reference samples pointed to interior carpeting installed in a small set of American sedans produced between 1974 and 1976. Among them, one model matched both the fiber characteristics and earlier witness recollections. A yellow 1975 sedan. The carpet color, pile density, and adhesive residue aligned with factory-installed interiors from that model line. Aftermarket replacements were ruled out due to differences in backing and dye stability. This mattered because it converted a vague vehicle theory into a defined object. Investigators revisited registration records and ownership histories connected to the identified family branch. One vehicle matched the model year, color, and ownership timeline during the winter. Andrew disappeared. The fiber no longer floated alone in the file. It sat in context, inside a specific car, during a specific period, connected to a defined group of people. The evidence had finally converged. The warrant did not come from suspicion, it came from convergence. By the time investigators returned to prosecutors, the case no longer rested on pattern alone. The DNA result linked a specific family line to direct contact with Andrew's coat. The fiber analysis tied that contact to the interior of a particular vehicle model. Registration records placed that vehicle in the control of a single individual during the winter of 1977. For the first time, evidence moved in one direction. Prosecutors reviewed the file again, this time with three elements aligned: biological material, material transfer, and ownership history. None of those elements stood alone. Together, they formed probable cause tied to a physical location. That location was a residence. Investigators outlined what they expected to find and why. Not guesses, not hopes. Items that logically followed from the evidence already confirmed. A firearm compatible with .22 caliber ammunition. Stored ammunition matching the recovered rounds. Possible modifications made to keep the weapon inaccessible or unnoticed. The request was narrow. It focused on one structure, one individual, and specific categories of evidence. That precision mattered. It reduced the risk of overreach and strengthened the legal footing of the search. When the judge signed the warrant, it marked the first time in decades that the case moved from theory to action. The evidence had waited. Now it was allowed to speak. The search team entered the residence in the early morning. The warrant specified interior spaces most likely to hold long-term storage: the garage, utility rooms, and basement. Officers documented each room before moving anything. Photographs were taken, measurements were logged. The layout was drawn by hand as the search progressed. The basement drew attention immediately. It was unfinished, with exposed framing and concrete walls. Storage shelves lined one side. A workbench sat beneath a single overhead light. The floor showed clear traffic patterns, with dust worn away along a narrow path leading toward the back wall. That path mattered. Basements accumulate clutter. When an area stays clear, it usually serves a purpose. Investigators followed the worn line to a section of wall that did not match the rest. The studs were newer. The paneling was more recent. The paint tone differed slightly under direct light. Measurements confirmed it. The depth of that wall section was inconsistent with the foundation. There was empty space behind it. At that point, the search shifted from inventory to inspection. Investigators examined the wall section without breaking it open. They checked fasteners first. The screws were modern compared to the surrounding framing. Their placement was uniform, spaced for removal rather than structural support. This was not reinforcement. It was access control. The panel was secured from the front, not the rear. That meant it was designed to be opened from inside the room, not sealed permanently. A pry bar was unnecessary. A screwdriver was enough. When the panel was removed, a narrow cavity was revealed between studs. The space was clean, no insulation, no debris, no signs of long-term airflow. That mattered because it showed the cavity had been kept closed and undisturbed. Inside, investigators found a wrapped object placed horizontally on a wooden brace. The brace had been added after the wall was built, anchored into the studs to prevent movement. This was not a casual hiding spot. The wrapping was layered, cloth, then plastic, then another cloth layer. Each served a purpose. The fabric reduced noise and abrasion. The plastic blocked moisture. Together, they prevented corrosion and odor. The storage method explained longevity. A weapon kept this way could remain functional for decades without routine handling. It could be removed, inspected, and returned without leaving visible disturbance in the room. The wall wasn't meant to hide clutter. It was built to isolate one item. Inside the wrapping was a .22 caliber firearm. The weapon showed minimal corrosion. The barrel was clean. The action moved smoothly. There was no rust consistent with long-term exposure. The storage method had worked exactly as intended. Investigators documented the condition before unloading it. The magazine was empty, but additional ammunition was found stored nearby in a sealed container within the same cavity. The rounds matched the caliber and general type recovered from Andrew's body. Later testing would confirm consistency in manufacturing characteristics. What mattered immediately was preservation. This firearm had not been discarded, sold, or broken down. It had been kept intact, accessible, and hidden in a place designed to avoid casual discovery. The false wall explained why it had never surfaced during previous inquiries. Ballistic testing followed. The recovered bullets from the autopsy were compared against test rounds fired from the weapon. Tool mark analysis showed matching characteristics consistent with the same barrel. Striations aligned. The results met the threshold for identification. The firearm was not just similar. It was the source. That discovery answered a question investigators had carried for decades and closed the loop between evidence, storage, and intent. The weapon had stayed hidden successfully because it was never abandoned. It was kept. Every firearm leaves a signature. Inside the barrel of a gun are spiral ridges called lands and grooves. Their purpose is mechanical, to stabilize a bullet as it travels forward, but the byproduct is forensic. As a bullet passes through, those ridges carve microscopic markings into its surface. No two barrels mark a bullet in exactly the same way. When investigators test-fired the recovered .22 caliber weapon, they collected multiple rounds under controlled conditions. Each bullet was catalogued, cleaned, and examined under comparison microscopes. The bullets recovered from Andrew's body were brought out of storage. Analysts compared striation patterns side by side, the width of the lands, the depth of the grooves, the spacing and angle of the markings, the minute imperfections created during manufacturing and wear over time. The alignment was consistent. These were not general similarities shared by many firearms. The markings followed the same paths, with the same irregularities repeating across samples. That repetition mattered. It showed continuity, not coincidence. This comparison did not rely on interpretation alone. It relied on physical agreement between surfaces that could only be produced by one barrel. For the first time in the case, evidence spoke without inference. Beyond traditional microscopy, analysts used 3D ballistic imaging to document the comparison. This technology creates high-resolution surface maps of bullets, capturing depth, curvature, and texture at a microscopic level. Instead of relying on visual alignment alone, the system converts markings into measurable data. Each land and groove impression becomes a topographical feature. The test-fired bullets from the recovered weapon were scanned first. Their surface maps were stored digitally. The bullets recovered from Andrew's body were then scanned using the same process. The system overlaid the images, matching areas aligned not just in pattern, but in depth and contour. Peaks matched peaks, valleys matched valleys, wear marks repeated in the same locations. These were not features shared by a class of firearms. They were individual characteristics. The advantage of this method was clarity. A jury would not need to trust an expert's description alone. The match could be shown visually, with measurements to support it. Differences would have appeared immediately if the bullets came from different barrels. They did not. This level of agreement removed subjective debate from the equation. The comparison became demonstrable rather than interpretive. The technology didn't replace earlier findings. It confirmed them. Ballistics evidence can be challenged when uncertainty exists. Here, it didn't. The comparison met multiple independent standards. Traditional microscope analysis showed repeating striations. 3D imaging confirmed depth and contour alignment. Test fires produced consistent results across several rounds, ruling out anomaly or damage-specific matches. Defense experts were given access to the same materials. They examined the weapon. They reviewed the test fires. They evaluated the comparison data. None could identify a credible alternative explanation. This mattered because disputes often arise from limited samples, degraded bullets, or incomplete documentation. None of those weaknesses were present here. The bullets recovered decades earlier had been preserved properly. The weapon was intact. The chain of custody was continuous. The conclusion did not rely on probability language. It relied on exclusion. No other firearm could have produced those markings. The question shifted from whether the weapon was involved to how long it had been hidden. At that point, argument stopped serving a purpose. The evidence no longer needed defense. It stood on its own. Once ballistics results were finalized, the case crossed a line it had never reached before. For decades, every conclusion had required inference. Patterns suggested intent. Evidence implied control. DNA narrowed possibility. But the firearm ended debate. The recovered weapon was not associated by proximity or ownership alone. It was connected by physical agreement at a microscopic level. The same barrel that fired the test rounds had fired the bullets recovered from Andrew's body. That agreement tied action to object and object to person. The weapon had been stored deliberately, protected from damage, and hidden in a structure designed to keep it unseen. Its condition showed care, not neglect. That care extended the life of the evidence until technology could catch up. Investigators no longer needed to argue theory. They could present fact. The gun removed all doubt. The arrest was scheduled for early morning. Investigators chose a time when movement would be minimal and conditions controlled. The warrant was limited in scope, focused on taking Gideon into custody and securing immediate items tied to the case. Officers approached without urgency. There was no forced entry. The knock was firm and deliberate. Gideon answered the door. He was informed of the warrant, placed in handcuffs, and escorted outside. No resistance was recorded. No questions were asked. The process lasted minutes. Inside the residence, officers conducted a brief sweep consistent with procedure. Nothing was seized during the arrest itself. The firearm and related evidence had already been documented during the search. This mattered because it framed the arrest as administrative rather than reactive. There was no confrontation. No escalation. The case had reached a point where action followed documentation, not suspicion. Gideon was transported to the station without incident. The absence of disruption stood out to everyone involved. At the station, Gideon was processed without delay. He acknowledged his name. He confirmed basic information. He did not request medical attention. He did not ask why the arrest was happening. His posture stayed neutral throughout intake. Investigators noted the behavior. There were no visible stress responses typically associated with sudden arrest. No pacing, no rapid speech, no visible agitation. He listened carefully, answered only what was required, and remained still while paperwork was completed. When informed of the charge, Gideon showed no outward reaction, no denial, no explanation, no visible confusion. That restraint mattered because it contrasted sharply with the weight of the evidence now assembled. People confronted unexpectedly often seek context or clarification. Gideon did neither. He asked for an attorney. The request was made calmly and immediately. Questioning stopped at that point in accordance with procedure. Officers documented the exchange verbatim. The tone, the timing, the lack of follow-up questions. Calm behavior, unsettling. After counsel was requested, investigators shifted to documentation. They laid out the evidence chronologically, not rhetorically. Dates, times, locations. Each item was tied to a record already entered into the case file. The firearm was referenced first. Its recovery location was described. The storage method was detailed. The chain of custody was documented from the moment it was removed from the wall cavity to the laboratory bench. Next came ballistics. Investigators explained the comparison process, noting that the conclusions were based on physical agreement between test rounds and recovered bullets. No speculative language was used. The findings were framed as measurable results. DNA evidence followed. The source location was identified. The testing method was outlined. The match was described in terms of exclusion rather than probability. The explanation stayed technical and brief. Finally, older evidence was reintroduced: the fiber, the coat, the ammunition type. Each item was connected back to the firearm and vehicle already established earlier in the investigation. Gideon was not asked to respond. The presentation was not an interrogation. It was a record of what had been proven. There was no formal questioning. Once legal representation was requested, investigators followed protocol. No attempt was made to elicit statements. No pressure was applied. No strategic silence was broken. What remained were observable facts. Gideon's behavior did not change during holding. He did not ask about evidence. He did not attempt to explain past actions. He did not contact anyone beyond his attorney. Investigators documented timing instead of dialogue: time from arrest to booking, time spent alone, time before transport. Nothing deviated from procedure. This absence of interaction became part of the record, not as inference, but as context. When suspects speak, their words are analyzed. When they do not, behavior still exists to be logged. The case had moved beyond persuasion. At this stage, the work was complete. The arrest marked the end of investigation and the beginning of prosecution. This case was not solved by confession or witness memory. It was solved by accumulation. Each piece of physical evidence carried forward independently of time. The coat remained sealed. The bullets stayed catalogued. The firearm, once recovered, linked backward through measurable traits rather than narrative explanation. What changed was not the evidence itself. What changed was the ability to examine it with greater precision. Modern comparison tools allowed older materials to be tested without reinterpretation. Results did not rely on recollection or character assessment. They relied on surface agreement, material consistency, and exclusion. The solution emerged when unrelated findings converged. Ballistics confirmed action. DNA narrowed identity. Material analysis tied environment to object. None of these elements worked alone. Together they closed the file. The delay was procedural, not mysterious. At the time of the original investigation, standards for prosecution required more than alignment of circumstances. Without a recovered weapon, prosecutors could not present a direct physical link between suspect and act. Forensic limitations also played a role. DNA testing did not exist in usable form. Material comparison lacked the resolution needed to narrow sources beyond general categories. Ballistics could suggest, but not confirm, without the firearm. Even when suspicion formed, it remained unsupported by chargeable proof. Investigators preserved what they could. Items were sealed rather than discarded. Documentation was maintained. The case stalled not because effort stopped, but because proof had not matured. Time did not weaken the case. It paused it. This case demonstrates why evidence handling matters more than early conclusions. Investigators did not force outcomes they could not support. They documented, stored, and deferred. That restraint preserved options for the future rather than closing them prematurely. Physical evidence does not argue. It waits. Proper labeling, sealed storage, and consistent chain of custody records allowed items collected in the 1970s to remain usable decades later. When technology advanced, those materials were ready for re-examination without credibility loss. Another lesson is prioritization. Not every case qualifies for reopening. This one did because its evidence base was intact and verifiable. Selection was driven by what could be tested, not by public pressure or narrative appeal. The process rewarded patience. Investigations do not end when progress stops. They end when evidence is exhausted. In this case, it never was. Memories degrade, statements change, people relocate, pass away, or reinterpret events through time. Physical evidence does none of these things. When preserved correctly, it remains stable and testable regardless of who is present to explain it. This case reached resolution because objects endured. A coat retained material transfer. Bullets preserved surface markings. A firearm maintained its mechanical identity. Each item carried information forward without commentary. The final outcome was not the result of renewed questioning or revisited testimony. It came from materials that had waited decades without alteration. Physical evidence doesn't age out. Subscribe to follow the next case.